every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in the jungle is thick. It's a living thing, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity and heat that clings to your skin, heavy with the primal scent of wet earth, blooming orchids, and blossoming decay. On November 18, 1978, in a remote clearing in the South American nation of Guyana, that air was also filled with sound. The frantic, omnipresent buzzing of insects, the distant alien calls of tropical birds, and underneath it all, a human voice, a voice amplified by a crude public address system echoing from a central open-air pavilion across a small, tidy settlement of several hundred wooden cottages. It was a voice of absolute authority, a voice that for years had been scripture, solace, and salvation for nearly 1,000 people. But on this day, the voice was not offering comfort. It was not promising paradise. It was delivering a death sentence. The voice belonged to the Reverend James Warren Jones, and the settlement, carved from the unforgiving jungle with sweat and desperate faith, was the People's Temple Agricultural Project, known to the world and to history as Jonestown. For those listening to that voice, the world had shrunk to this single clearing. They were thousands of miles from home, systematically cut off from family, from news, from any reality but the one Jones had meticulously constructed for them over the course of decades. He spoke of honor, of dignity, of a final defiant act against a cruel and capitalist world that would not let them live in peace. He spoke of conspiracies, of shadowy enemies closing in, of airborne invaders who would torture their children. He called it a revolutionary suicide, a glorious protest, not an act of self-destruction. And as he spoke, his most trusted lieutenants, the nurses and guards of his inner circle, moved among the crowd. They carried syringes, stacks of paper cups, and a large metal vat filled with a purple liquid. It was a cheap grape drink, flavor aid, mixed with a deadly cocktail of potassium cyanide and powerful sedatives like Valium and chloral hydrate. The first to die were the most vulnerable. The babies, the toddlers, the children. The poison was squirted down their throats with needleless syringes, a grotesque parody of giving medicine. The recordings of that final hour, the infamous FBI Q042, the death tape, preserve their terrified cries. They preserve the unspeakable anguish of parents holding their own dying children. And they preserve the chillingly calm, insistent, almost bored voice of Jim Jones, orchestrating the end. "Stop this hysterics," he commanded, as the first wails began. "This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. This is a revolutionary suicide. We are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act." How does a man lead over 900 people? Men, women, and more than 300 children, to their own annihilation in a single sweltering afternoon? This is a question that has haunted us for decades, often reduced to a simple, dismissive punchline: "Don't drink the Kool-Aid." But that phrase, a misremembered detail from this very tragedy, is a profound and cruel disservice to the victims. It implies they were foolish, weak-willed, or simply insane. The truth is infinitely more complex, and far more terrifying. The people of Jonestown were not fools. They were idealists, seekers, people broken by a society that had failed them, who were offered a concrete vision of a better world. They were doctors and lawyers, teachers and social workers, secretaries and laborers, entire families, black and white, who sought a utopia of racial equality and social justice. What happened to them was not a single moment of madness, but the final logical endpoint of a long and systematic process of psychological demolition and ideological reconstruction. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a cult. We will explore the gradual, insidious process by which one man's pathological narcissism became the unquestionable reality for 1,000 followers. We will trace the life of Jim Jones and the evolution of the People's Temple, not just to recount the horrors of that final day, but to meticulously map the architecture of coercive control, the weaponization of hope, the gradual elimination of dissent, the love bombing, the isolation, the induced paranoia, the manufactured miracles, and the relentless propaganda that made Jonestown not just possible, but in the twisted logic of the world he had built, inevitable. This is the story of how the very human search for paradise led 900 people to hell on earth. To understand the end, we must begin with the architect of the apocalypse, James Warren Jones. He was not born a monster. Monsters are made, not born. And he was forged by the peculiar circumstances of his upbringing and the vast unfillable emptiness within him. Born in 1931 in the tiny, impoverished town of Crete, Indiana, during the bleakest years of the Great Depression, Jones was a child of neglect and strange premonitions. His father, James Thurman Jones, was a disabled World War I veteran, a man gassed in the trenches of France, his spirit and body broken. He was also a member of the Ku Klux Klan, a fact that his son would later both rebel against and, in his own way, emulate through a different brand of absolutism. His mother, Lynetta Putnam Jones, was a different force entirely. Ambitious, intelligent, fiercely independent, and deeply unconventional for her time and place, Lynetta worked long hours in a factory and held a mystical belief that she had given birth not just to a son, but to a Messiah. She filled young Jimmy's head with stories of his special destiny, nurturing a nascent sense of grandiosity that would later metastasize into a full-blown God complex. She was his first true believer, the origin point of the myth of Jim Jones. He was a strange, lonely, and profoundly morbid child. While other boys played baseball, Jimmy played church. He was obsessed with religion, and more tellingly, with death. He would gather neighborhood children to attend elaborate funerals he staged for small animals. Cats, dogs, even mice. He delivered impassioned, rambling eulogies over their small graves, a small boy performing the rituals of power and finality. In one chilling anecdote, he allegedly killed a cat with a knife, specifically to demonstrate the finality of death to a friend. He was a performer from the very beginning, studying the fiery cadences of Pentecostal preachers he heard on the radio, practicing his sermons on anyone who would listen. He saw early on the immense power that charismatic faith held over people, the way it could command attention, devotion, and, most importantly, obedience. His mother worked, and his father was largely absent, leaving Jimmy functionally abandoned and isolated. He found his first true congregation not in a church, but in his family's barn, where he preached to the animals. Even then, he was testing the limits of his power. He sought not just an audience, but total control. This deep-seated pathological need for absolute dominion over his environment became the defining feature of his personality, the dark engine that would drive him for the rest of his life. In the early 1950s, after a brief stint in college and a marriage to a nurse named Marceline Baldwin, who was drawn to his passionate idealism, Jones found his true calling. He became a student pastor in Indianapolis, but bristled under the authority of established denominations. He didn't want to be a cog in someone else's machine. He needed to build his own kingdom. In 1955, using money he'd made by importing and selling live monkeys as pets, he opened his first church, initially called Wings of Deliverance. It was later renamed the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. From its very inception, the People's Temple was different. In the deeply segregated landscape of 1950s Indiana, a state with a strong KKK presence, Jones's church was radically, defiantly integrated. He welcomed African American congregants with open arms, seating them beside white families, a practice that was not just progressive but physically dangerous. He was harassed, threatened, and his family was targeted. Swastikas were painted on his home. A dead cat was thrown on his porch. But the persecution only strengthened his resolve and, crucially, the loyalty of his flock. It created the us versus them dynamic that would become his most powerful tool. For many of his early followers, particularly African Americans fleeing the brutal oppression of the Jim Crow South, Jones was a messiah in a very real sense. He offered more than just spiritual guidance. He provided a tangible community. He opened soup kitchens, ran employment services, and established nursing homes. The temple was a social safety net for the poor and the marginalized, a place where the promises of the gospel were made real. He and Marceline adopted several children of different races, creating what he called his rainbow family, a living symbol of the racial utopia he promised to build. This was the brilliant, seductive promise of the People's Temple. Jones tapped into the genuine social ills of his time: racism, poverty, systemic inequality, and positioned himself as the sole charismatic solution. He offered a simple, powerful bargain: give me your complete devotion, and I will give you a perfect world, a heaven on earth. For people who had been ignored, abused, and disenfranchised by a deeply flawed society, it was an irresistible offer. And in those early days, for many, he seemed to deliver. The temple was a place of hope, a vibrant community built on laudable principles of social justice. But beneath the utopian surface, a sinister architecture of control was already being constructed, brick by psychological brick, laying a foundation of absolute loyalty that would one day be transported to the jungle. The first major test of this loyalty was a physical one. In the mid-1960s, Jones began preaching that a nuclear apocalypse was imminent, feeding on the pervasive Cold War anxieties of the era. He claimed to have had a divine vision, one detailed in an article in Esquire magazine, that the city of Ukiah in Northern California would be one of the few places on Earth to survive the coming Holocaust. In 1965, he led his core congregation of about 140 followers on a modern-day exodus from Indiana to their new promised land in Redwood Valley, California. This move was a critical, strategic step in his methodology of control. By transplanting his flock 2,000 miles across the country, he severed their ties to their old lives, to skeptical family members, to outside friends, to jobs, and to the familiar support systems that might have offered a different perspective or a path of retreat. They were now in a new place, completely dependent on Jones and the temple for their social, financial, and spiritual well-being. Isolation is the soil in which cults grow, and with the move to California, the ideological seeds of Jonestown were planted in fertile ground. In California, the People's Temple flourished beyond Jones's wildest dreams. He expanded his operations from the rural base in Ukiah to the major urban centers of San Francisco and Los Angeles. Attracting thousands of new members, he deftly shifted his public focus from Pentecostal-style Christianity to a unique, potent blend of socialist politics and messianic worship. He was no longer just a preacher, he was a political revolutionary. The temple became a formidable political machine, particularly in the turbulent landscape of 1970s San Francisco. Its members were disciplined, organized, and could be mobilized at a moment's notice to stuff envelopes, attend rallies, or vote as a single, powerful bloc. Prominent politicians, including Mayor George Moscone, Assemblyman Willie Brown, and Supervisor Harvey Milk, openly courted Jones for his support. He could deliver thousands of votes and fill a rally on a few hours' notice. In return for this political capital, he was gifted with legitimacy. He was appointed chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. He met with First Lady Rosalind Carter. To the outside world, Jim Jones was a respected, even heroic, civic leader, a champion of the poor, a fighter for racial justice, and a powerful political ally. But inside the temple, behind the locked doors and the smiling public facade, the reality was a burgeoning totalitarian state. The benevolent father of the public eye was a tyrannical dictator in private. The architecture of his control became a sophisticated system of psychological warfare waged against his own followers. It began, as it so often does, with love. New recruits were subjected to love bombing, an overwhelming, intoxicating display of affection and attention. They were told they were special, that they had finally found a place where they truly belonged, a real family. This created a powerful emotional bond and a deep sense of indebtedness. Once a member's devotion was secured, the systematic process of stripping away their individual identity began. Jones demanded total, unconditional commitment. Members were pressured, then forced, to live communally, surrendering their homes, their cars, their savings, and their weekly paychecks to the church. He controlled every intimate aspect of their lives. He dictated who they could marry, if they could have children, and even who they had sex with. He systematically broke apart existing family units, turning children into informants against their own parents for any perceived disloyalty. He would then rebrand himself as their one true father, the only family they needed. Life inside the temple was a grueling, non-stop cycle of work, indoctrination, and fear. Members worked 16-hour days for little or no pay in temple-run businesses or as staff for the organization. Their evenings were consumed by marathon meetings, often lasting until 2 or 3 in the morning, where Jones would preach for hours on end. This calculated sleep deprivation was a powerful tool, breaking down his followers' cognitive defenses, eroding their ability to reason, and making them more susceptible to his increasingly bizarre and paranoid message. His sermons were a relentless barrage of propaganda, painting the outside world as a hellscape of racism, fascism, and capitalist greed. The temple, he preached, was the only ark, the only safe haven from the coming storm. He began to shed his Christian trappings, at times throwing the Bible to the floor and shouting, "This is an idol, you don't need this. You need me, I am your God." To cement his divine status, Jones staged elaborate and theatrical faith healings. These were not simple sleight-of-hand tricks. They were carefully orchestrated productions. His aides would covertly gather information about new members, learning their medical histories and personal anxieties from spies or during confessionals. Then, during a service, Jones would call out a person's name and divinely diagnose their specific ailment. He would perform a dramatic healing, sometimes appearing to pull bloody cancerous growths from their bodies. These growths were, in reality, rotting chicken gizzards and livers supplied by a temple accomplice. For true believers in the audience, these miracles were undeniable proof of his divinity. For those who harbored doubts, the intense social pressure to conform was immense. To question Father was to risk public humiliation or worse. Discipline was brutal, ritualized, and public. Transgressions, both real and imagined, were punished in horrifying catharsis sessions. Before the entire congregation, a member would be forced onto a stage to confess their sins, doubting Jones, missing their outside family, expressing fatigue, even making a simple mistake at their job. They were then subjected to vicious verbal abuse from Jones and the crowd, followed by brutal physical beatings, sometimes by their own family members, goaded on by Jones to prove their loyalty. Humiliating boxing matches were staged between a terrified, disobedient member and a much stronger, more loyal opponent. This public degradation served a dual purpose. It terrified individuals into absolute compliance and strengthened the group's cohesion by forcing everyone to participate in the abuse of their peers, making them all complicit in the temple's cruelty. Jones's own hypocrisy was staggering and absolute. While he demanded celibacy or strictly controlled pairings for his followers, he engaged in constant sexual affairs with both male and female members. He claimed it was a test of their loyalty, a revolutionary act to break down their bourgeois hang-ups about monogamy. In reality, it was a raw, predatory exercise of power. One of his most consequential affairs was with a high-ranking temple lawyer, Grace Stone. He pressured her to sign an affidavit stating that he was the father of her son, John Victor Stone. This document, and the subsequent custody battle when the Stones defected, would become a central obsession for Jones, a key driver of his escalating paranoia. He was a prodigious drug user, fueling his paranoia and erratic behavior with a daily cocktail of amphetamines to preach for hours and powerful barbiturates to sleep. As his drug use escalated, so did his megalomania and his obsession with conspiracies. He was convinced the CIA was watching him, that the media was a cabal of vultures plotting to destroy him, that enemies were everywhere. This paranoia became the temple's organizing principle. The outside world was not just corrupt, it was actively trying to annihilate them. It was in this climate of escalating fear that Jones first introduced the ultimate test of loyalty, the final solution, the concept of revolutionary suicide. He brilliantly framed it not as an act of despair, but as a noble, political act of protest against a fascist America. They would not allow their enemies to destroy their beautiful community. They would choose the dignity and power of their own deaths. It was to be a heroic, defiant end to their utopian experiment. He began to hold drills, which he ominously called White Nights. In the middle of the night, a siren would blare, and everyone, from the elderly to mothers carrying infants, would rush to the main meeting hall. Jones would announce that they were surrounded by enemies, that their time had come. He would have his lieutenants distribute a red liquid in cups and order everyone to drink it, telling them it was poison and that they would all be dead in 45 minutes. They would drink. They would wait to die, holding their children, saying their goodbyes. And then, after an agonizing hour of terror, Jones would reveal that it was only he would praise them for their courage, for their willingness to die for the cause. This horrifying ritual was repeated over 50 times, desensitizing his followers to the idea of mass suicide, transforming the unthinkable into a routine, a drill, a sacrament, an act of ultimate faith. By the mid-1970s, the pressure on Jones was mounting. The media, particularly New West magazine, was preparing to publish a damning exposé based on the accounts of high-level defectors. The group of concerned relatives, organized by the Stones and other defectors like Jeannie and Al Mills, was becoming more vocal. lobbying the government to investigate the systematic abuse and financial misconduct. Jones's California paradise was becoming a prison, and he knew he was losing his grip. He needed a new, more isolated location to maintain his absolute control. He needed a place where no one could leave, and no one could look in. He found it in the dense, remote jungle of Guyana, a small English-speaking socialist nation on the northern coast of South America. The Guyanese government, led by the authoritarian Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, was sympathetic to Jones's socialist rhetoric and eager for the investment and development his project promised. It was a perfect match of mutual convenience. In 1974, the first pioneers from the People's Temple arrived to begin clearing a tract of nearly 4,000 acres of unforgiving jungle. For the next 3 years, they labored under tortuous conditions, transforming the raw wilderness into a functioning agricultural settlement. They built hundreds of small cottages, a school, a sawmill, and a large central pavilion. They planted crops and raised livestock. They called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The world would come to know it as Jonestown. In the summer of 1977, just as the New West article was about to be published, Jones ordered the final exodus. In a matter of months, nearly 1,000 of his followers, the majority of them African American, sold their possessions, signed over their Social Security checks, and moved to this supposed tropical paradise. They were promised a new beginning, a socialist utopia far from the racism and corruption of America. What they found was a concentration camp disguised as a commune. Life in Jonestown was a living hell. The workday began before dawn and ended long after dusk, 6.5 days a week, in the brutal tropical heat and humidity. Food was scarce and monotonous, often consisting of little more than rice, beans, and sometimes gravy, while Jones and his inner circle ate imported food in his private cottage. Malnutrition and diseases like severe diarrhea were rampant. Their entire world was mediated by Jones. The enormous public address system broadcast his voice across the settlement 24 hours a day. He would read the news, interspersing it with his own paranoid commentary, or simply deliver rambling, drug-fueled monologues for hours on end. There was no escape from his voice, no private thoughts, no escape from his presence. All communication with the outside world was censored. Letters sent home were opened and read, often rewritten by temple staff. Phone calls were monitored. Passports and personal funds were confiscated upon arrival, and armed guards, Jones's personal security force known as the Red Brigade, patrolled the perimeter of the settlement, not to keep intruders out, but to keep the residents in. Anyone who expressed a desire to leave was branded a traitor. They were drugged into submission, publicly humiliated in catharsis sessions, or forced into an extra care unit that was effectively a torture box. The White Knight suicide drills continued, now with more frequency and more terrifying intensity. Jones would tell them that mercenaries were hiding in the jungle, that the Guyanese army was coming to destroy them. He kept them in a constant state of terror, their nervous systems frayed, their ability to think critically obliterated. The only path to safety, the only path to salvation was through him. Yet, despite the horror, many still believed. They had sacrificed everything for this cause. Their homes, their families, their former lives, it was all gone. To admit that it was all a lie, that the man they worshipped as God was a fraud and a monster, would have been a psychological self-annihilation. The cognitive dissonance was too great. It was easier to believe in the paradise, even as they were living in a nightmare. It was easier to believe in the Father, even as he was methodically preparing them for their graves. But the outside world could not be held at bay forever. The concerned relatives group grew more organized and desperate. Their greatest fear was that Jones, cornered and increasingly unhinged by the custody battle over John Stowen, would make good on his threat of mass suicide. Their persistent pleas finally found a receptive ear in Leo Ryan, a Democratic congressman from California's 11th District. Ryan was a unique politician, a man with a reputation as a maverick, a hands-on legislator who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He had once had himself smuggled into Folsom Prison for 10 days to investigate conditions there. When relatives of his constituents brought him their terrifying stories of abuse and false imprisonment in Jonestown, he decided he had to see it for himself. In November of 1978, despite strong warnings from the State Department, Ryan announced he would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown. He would be accompanied by congressional aides, a team of journalists, and several of the concerned relatives. For Jim Jones, Ryan's visit was the ultimate existential threat. It was the outside world, the enemy he had railed against for years, knocking at his front gate. The fragile, hermetically sealed reality he had constructed was about to be breached. He initially refused the visit, but under pressure from the Guyanese government, he finally relented. He would allow the congressman to come, but he would stage manage the entire affair. When Ryan's delegation arrived in Jonestown on November 17, 1978, they were greeted with a carefully rehearsed spectacle. They walked into what appeared to be a vibrant, happy community. The cottages were tidy, the grounds were well kept, and they were welcomed with a festive dinner and a high-energy musical performance by the Jonestown Express Band in the pavilion. The residents, under the watchful eyes of Jones's lieutenants, seemed joyful, praising Jim Jones and their utopian life in the jungle. But it was a performance, a Potemkin village staged under immense duress. Ryan and the seasoned journalists with him sensed the profound tension beneath the surface. They noticed the vacant, exhausted looks in people's eyes. And then, the facade began to crack. During the festivities, a reporter, Don Harris of NBC, was secretly passed a folded note by a temple member named Vernon Gosney. It read, "Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, please help us get out of Jonestown." Another member passed a similar note to an NBC correspondent. By the next morning, Saturday, November 18th, a small but steady stream of people had secretly approached the delegation, whispering desperate pleas to be taken with them. In all, 16 temple members summoned the courage to defect. Jones was enraged. He saw the defections as a profound and public betrayal, a humiliation that shattered his carefully constructed image of a devoted, unified flock. He tried to talk the defectors out of leaving, pleading with some, threatening others. But their minds were made up. In a tense confrontation with Jones, captured on camera, Congressman Ryan stood firm, declaring that he would be taking anyone who wished to leave with him. He told Jones plainly, "There are some people who believe this is the best thing that ever happened to them in their whole lives, and there are some people who say they are in a state of terror." The breaking point came as the delegation and the defectors were preparing to leave for the small, remote airstrip at Port Kaituma, a few miles away. As Congressman Ryan was getting ready to depart, a temple member named Don Sly, feigning a sad goodbye, suddenly attacked him with a knife. The attack was thwarted by Ryan's aides, but the spell was broken. The violence that had been simmering just beneath the surface had finally, irrevocably erupted. The delegation and the terrified defectors scrambled to leave, piling into a large dump truck for the bumpy journey to the airstrip. They were shaken, but they believed the worst was over. They had escaped. They were tragically wrong. as they waited at the Port Kaituma airstrip for two small planes, a Cessna and a larger Otter, to take them back to Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. A tractor and trailer from Jonestown pulled up near the runway. It was filled with members of Jim Jones's personal guards, the Red Brigade. They were armed with rifles and shotguns. Without a word, they stood up and opened fire. The scene was one of utter chaos and carnage. People screamed and ran for cover in the surrounding bush. The gunmen were methodical, shooting to kill. NBC cameraman Bob Brown bravely filmed the attack until the moment he was shot dead. Don Harris, the reporter who had received the first secret note, was also killed. Greg Robinson, a photographer for the San Francisco Examiner, died trying to shield others with his body. Patricia Parks, one of the defectors seeking freedom, was gunned down. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times. When the shooting stopped, 5 people lay dead on the tarmac, and 11 more were wounded. The link to the outside world had been violently and permanently severed. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones knew there was no turning back. He had murdered a United States congressman. The end he had rehearsed for years had finally come. He sounded the alarm. The residents of Jonestown gathered one last time in the open-air pavilion. The armed guards who had just returned from the airstrip took up positions around the perimeter, their weapons making it clear that this was not a voluntary assembly. Jones took the microphone. His voice, captured on that 44-minute cassette tape, is the final horrifying record of the People's Temple. He was rambling, paranoid, high on drugs, but his message was chillingly clear. The time for the White Night had come. This was not a drill. "They won't leave us alone," he declared, his voice slurring slightly. "They're now going back to tell more lies. So my opinion is that we be kind to children, and be kind to seniors, and take the potion like they used to take in ancient Greece, and step over quietly." A large metal tub of the poison-laced grape drink was brought forward. The plan he had rehearsed so many times was put into motion. The children were to die first, to remove the parents' will to live. The tape records the sounds of parents forcing the poison down their children's throats. The children are crying, screaming. In the midst of the horror, one woman, Christine Miller, can be heard bravely, desperately arguing, pleading with Jones. "I think we all have a right to say what we think," she says, her voice shaking but firm. "I feel like as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith." Another woman shouts her down. "We've made a beautiful life here," she cries. "If they come in, they're going to torture our children. We may as well die." Jones is insistent, his voice a chilling mix of paternal comfort and absolute command. "Mother, mother, mother, please, don't do this. Lay down your life with your child. Free at last." He frames the act as a release from suffering, a beautiful transition. He tells them there is nothing to fear. "Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life," he says. "If you knew what was ahead of you, you'd be glad to be stepping over tonight." The resistance crumbled under the weight of his authority, the pressure from true believers, and the presence of armed guards. The sounds of protest were replaced by a chilling orderliness. One by one, families lined up. They took their paper cups of poison. They drank. They walked away from the pavilion to lie down on the grass with their families and wait for death. The cyanide induced agonizing convulsions and suffocation before it stopped their hearts. For those who hesitated, guards were there to assist them with injections. It was not a simple mass suicide. It was a mass murder, coerced by a madman who had systematically dismantled his followers' will to live and then backed it up with guns and crossbows. In the end, Jim Jones did not drink the poison. As his flock lay dying around him in the twilight, he sat in his chair on the pavilion stage. He died from a single gunshot wound to the head. It remains unclear if he pulled the trigger himself, or if he was shot by a loyal aide in a final act of devotion. By the time Guyanese troops arrived the next day, the silence was absolute. The clearing was filled with bodies, lying side by side, many in family embraces, in a grotesque tableau of community. The final death toll in Jonestown was 909 people, including the victims at the airstrip, and a handful of others in the temple's Georgetown headquarters, who followed Jones's final orders. The total number of dead was 918. More than 300 of them were children. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. The aftermath of Jonestown was a scene of unparalleled horror that stunned the globe. The world struggled to comprehend the surreal images coming out of the Guyanese jungle, an endless sea of bodies, a utopian dream turned into a mass grave. The task of identifying and repatriating the dead was a logistical and emotional nightmare for the handful of survivors, those who had been away on errands or who had managed to escape into the jungle. The trauma was immeasurable. They had lost everyone they knew and loved, and were left to grapple not only with their grief, but with a world that could not begin to understand what they had been through. So, we return to our central question. How did this happen? The anatomy of this cult, the People's Temple, is a terrifying case study in the mechanics of absolute power. Its success rested on a blueprint for how to capture the human soul, a blueprint with several key components. First was the charismatic, narcissistic leader. Jim Jones was a master manipulator who possessed an uncanny ability to perceive and exploit the deepest needs and vulnerabilities of others. He offered simple, certain answers to life's most complex and painful questions. To the disenfranchised, he offered power. To the lonely, he offered community. To the idealist, he offered a perfect world. He presented himself as a Messiah, the sole vessel of truth, and systematically positioned himself as the only solution to his followers' problems, making dependency on him feel like salvation. Second was the utopian, all-or-nothing ideology. Jones created a powerful us versus them narrative. The outside world was evil, corrupt, racist, and doomed. The temple was the only pure, safe place on earth. This binary worldview simplified reality and fostered an intense group cohesion, bonded by a shared sense of persecution and specialness. Belief was not a matter of choice, it was presented as a matter of survival. Third was the meticulous process of indoctrination and isolation. Jones didn't ask for everything at once. The path to Jonestown was a gradual descent, a series of seemingly small compromises. It began with attending meetings, then donating money. Over time, the demands escalated, until members had surrendered their homes, their families, their finances, their sexuality, and ultimately, their critical thinking, by physically isolating them, first in rural California, and then in the jungles of Guyana. He cut off all dissenting information and created a closed, self-referential world where his voice was the only reality. Fourth was the constant cultivation of fear and existential threat. The White Night drills, the stories of lurking CIA conspiracies, the warnings of imminent attack, these were not just tools of terror. They were a way of keeping his followers in a perpetual state of crisis, a physiological state in which the capacity for rational thought is severely diminished. When you are sleep-deprived, malnourished, and truly believe your children are about to be captured and tortured by a fascist enemy, a revolutionary suicide can be twisted to seem like a merciful, logical, and even noble act of love. Finally, we must examine the failure of institutions. For years, credible reports of abuse, kidnapping, and financial crimes were ignored. Politicians in San Francisco, eager for the temple's political support, turned a blind eye and actively praised Jones. Government agencies were slow to act on the desperate pleas of the concerned relatives. The press, for a long time, celebrated Jones as a progressive leader. His evil was allowed to fester and grow in plain sight because it was cloaked in the language of social justice and empowered by a complicit political establishment. The people of Jonestown were not monsters or fools. They were human beings, idealistic, flawed, hopeful, who were searching for meaning, for community, for a better world. They were drawn in by a beautiful promise of paradise, and then systematically stripped of their ability to recognize the hell they were living in. They are a testament to the terrifying power of coercive control and the fragility of the human mind when subjected to sustained psychological manipulation. The greatest tragedy of Jonestown is not just that over 900 people died, but that they died for a paradise that existed only in the mind of the man who led them to their deaths, a chilling testament to the fact that the most inescapable prison is not built of jungle and fences, but of corrupted belief. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.